Welcome everyone to another Fireside Chat hosted by Credo Wealth. For those of you that don't know us, Credo is an independent wealth management business founded in 1998 with assets under advisory of over £4 billion, with over 7,000 clients across UK, South Africa and the rest of the world. I'm Ainsley, Head of Multi-Asset based here in London, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest today. So Alex Edmans is a Professor of Finance at London Business School. Alex has a PhD from MIT as a Fulbright Scholar and was previously a tenured professor at Wharton and an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. Alex has spoken at the World Economic Forum in Davos, testified in the UK Parliament, and his two TED Talks, What to Trust in a Post-Truth World and The Social Responsibility of Business, have a combined 2 million views. He serves as Mercer's School Memorial Professor of Business at Gresham College and on Royal London Asset Management's Responsible Investment Advisory Committee. Alex's book, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, was featured in the Financial Times list of Business Books of the Year for 2020. He's been named to Poets and Quant's Best 40 Professors Under 40 and Thinkers 50 radar. So Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Ainsley. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Perfect. And where are you speaking to us from today?
From Bayswater, central London. But at least I'm close to Hyde Park, so I sort of feel that people's happiness in pandemic is linked to how much green space they have. So while in central London you're in Garden, at least there's green space close to me.
Great. And how are things going over there otherwise?
I think pandemic is like, if you told me like a year ago, I think it's probably a year that we've been in lockdown, that I'd be locked down for a year, I'd have been very upset. But actually, just things react. And so the fact that technology has reacted in such a positive way and innovation to allow us to do a lot of things is positive. And so when the world goes back to normal, if indeed business is more conducted online, then I think this will be great for our carbon footprint. I think it's good for working parents that can't be conducted face to face. And for junior people, they obviously want the mentorship from senior people, particularly in like professional service firms and other companies. But I do think if we're allowed to have flexibility being a long-term thing, then some of the sort of shoots from this otherwise very devastating pandemic will hopefully be ones that will be permanent.
And then you're a regular public speaker and presenter. I think we actually first met a couple of years ago at a live conference when you were speaking. But how do you find adjusting in terms of presenting and live speaking to the virtual world?
I've enjoyed it, and it's actually it has been fortunate because I'm able to do talks to all across the globe. And so what I'm really interested in is responsible business. And that's something which is not just a UK phenomenon. Companies all around the world are trying to act more responsibly. And so I am grateful that this has given me greater bandwidth to speak about this message to a wider audience. And also it's not just in the form of talks to specific companies. Things like this, so webinars and podcasts and so on are really important to spread the message of responsibility. And in particular, I think people in the past thought it was like a nice to have extra. There was a moral case to it, but I'm really about showing it's a business case. So it's something that should be central to a company or central to an investment strategy.
So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about your personal journey and how you ended up at LBS.
Absolutely. So I did economics and management at Oxford, and like most people who study economics at Oxford, I went to the city. So I went to Morgan Stanley, and I was in London doing investment banking, and also did fixed income sales and trading in New York. And I actually enjoyed my time there. So you do have a lot of people say, oh, I had to work really hard and was mistreated. That wasn't at all the case for me. I really liked the people I worked with. However, when I worked on a deal, let's say, I would spend maybe 8 months of my life solving one company's problems at that time. So it might have been selling a non-core business for a UK bank. And that's obviously useful for that bank, but the bandwidth of your contribution was limited to that company. So as a professor, if I can speak about responsible business, that can be something which is useful for many companies in different industries, in different countries, and in different time periods. So while obviously we're not paid the same as we are in investment bankers, I think what you're doing in terms of generating knowledge and disseminating knowledge might reach more people than the actions of a banker with a small set of clients.
And you spent some time in the US at Wharton, is that right?
Yeah, so I did my PhD at MIT Sloan, which was a fantastic place to study. So I was really lucky to be at Oxford as an undergrad, but really for business schools, the top ones are in the US, just because they just have a long tradition of having business schools being there, and also just a lot of the largest companies are there, and the funding there is much higher for research than it will be here. So I started at MIT. I was really lucky to learn from Stu Myers. So some of your listeners might have the book Principles of Corporate Finance by Breland Myers. That was always seen the Bible of finance. When I studied at Oxford, that's what we had. When I started at Morgan Stanley, everybody was given it. I'm now really lucky to be a co-author of that book. So the 14th edition will be with me also on it. But it was great to learn from one of the greats of finance. And then after MIT, I started as a professor at Wharton, which again was a fantastic school to be part of, really top notch in terms of academic excellence and the quality of the students. Some companies that you will know, like Deliveroo or Warby Parker, were founded by some students at Wharton at the time. So just the entrepreneurial spirit was fantastic. And it was really a great place to start my academic career.
Fantastic. Well, we're very excited to have this conversation with you, particularly because you've done a lot of work on purposeful business and ESG investing, which is the introduction of environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment process in various ways. And it's very much at the forefront of many investors' minds today. But in particular, because certainly in terms of myself having followed some of your work, you seem to have quite different, unique perspectives on the topic, particularly compared to maybe some of the marketing material we get from investment firms out there. So I'd love to start with very broadly how you define ESG investing and your assessment of the landscape in terms of the popular approaches out there currently.
Absolutely, thanks for asking. So I think that the traditional view of ESG is what I call the pie splitting mentality. So what do I mean by that? It views the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And it says a responsible business is one that splits the pie fairly. So it doesn't make too much profits. Instead, it pays higher taxes than it needs to. It pays high wages than it needs to, and so on. And clearly those things are important, right? Fairness is important. So we need to make sure wages are fair and taxes are not the minimum that you can get away with. And indeed, a lot of ESG metrics looks at things like that, such as the CEO to worker pay ratio. But I think that's only one part of responsibility. Being a responsible business is being about growing the pie. So what do I mean by this? I mean creating social value, and that may involve innovation. So let's think about the pandemic, which is what we were talking about earlier. If Mercedes does something like use its engineering expertise to make CPAP breathing machines, so that is a less invasive alternative to ventilators, that doesn't show up in many ESG metrics. That's not going to show up in cutting its carbon emissions. It probably will actually increase them. It's not going to show up in its diversity inclusion metrics because it doesn't involve hiring any new people. And it doesn't show up in terms of lower taxes or changes in the pay ratio. Yet that's something that could save many people's lives. So that's about innovation, using their expertise in new areas. And this is not just something in the pandemic. So Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant, about 14 years ago launched M-Pesa, this mobile money service in Africa, which lifted 200,000 households out of poverty in the first 7 years. So when I speak about growing the pie, people think, oh, I mean growth, I mean sort of growing financial wealth. And isn't that problematic because there's some planetary boundaries? But that's not what I mean by growing the pie, because the pie is not wealth, it is social value. So what I think companies need to do is to think innovatively about what is the resources that my company has and how can I use them to serve wider society. So I often ask the question, what is in my hand? Right? If you're a leader, you're entrusted with resources and expertise. How can you use this to serve society? And so this is what I feel is somewhat missing from this ESG discussion. We want companies to do no harm, right? Not cheat on taxes, not pollute the environment, not pay their workers too little. Obviously, that's really important. But I would say in 2021, given the magnitude of the world's problems, it's not enough for a company not to do harm. It needs to actively do good. And I think that is something which is not really captured in many ESG metrics.
And I thought it was very interesting in your first TED talk sort of 5 or 6 years ago on socially responsible business. You actually put up a slide with some of the ESG data providers. So Truecost, Sustainalytics, and a few others. And you asked the audience 500 odd investors who had heard of them, and nobody put their hand up. I imagine that's very much flipped on its head today in terms of the popularity of some of these data. And you mentioned metrics is the move of a lot of approaches to focus quantitatively on this data. Is that a trend you see continuing, and is that certainly an issue in terms of the speed of growth that we're seeing with the adoption of these metrics?
It's really interesting you said that, and actually I've done so many of these talks and no one's brought that up before, so it's really interesting that you brought it up. So for those who didn't see my TEDx talk, what the social responsibility of business, back then I was saying people were paying too little attention to sustainability and ESG metrics. Now I think we're going too far to the other extreme. We're paying too much attention to them. So now responsibility has become a really popular thing, and that's really good. But sometimes people focus, I think, on the wrong metrics. So a lot of these measures will be on the do no harm aspects of companies, not looking at them actively doing good. So let me just give an example. As you mentioned, I serve on the Responsible Investment Advisory Committee of Royal London Asset Management, and we have a number of sustainable funds. And one of these new metrics is MSCI's warming tool. So what this will do is to calculate the warming potential of your portfolio. And when we ran our portfolio through this, we found that the worst offenders are semiconductor companies. Why? Because when you produce semiconductors, the production process releases perfluorocarbons, and they're even worse than carbon in trapping in heat. Yet, semiconductors will probably power the solutions to global warming, and they also have many other positive uses. They're used in microchips, which can go in mobile phones, and if you give a phone to somebody in a developing country, you save their life. So, if indeed you were to have a portfolio saying, I'm going to just divest in anything that contributes to global warming, that's really popular, but it may not be the best thing. I'm someone who obviously really, really cares about global warming, but the idea of divesting from all of these companies that contribute to it might not be the right thing to do. Why? Number one, it might be that even if a company contributes to global warming, it might have lots of social benefits. And number two, sometimes the best way to address decarbonisation might be to buy companies with a footprint and work with them in order to accelerate their transition. So there are indeed a number of energy companies which are, I think, being very serious about decarbonisation. It's not necessarily clear that we want to completely divest from them. We might want to engage with them and hold them accountable for actually delivering on the transition plan that they have outlined.
Because that's certainly a very popular approach, and it is one of many, but many strategies use a screening approach where they'll look at the universe and they'll exclude companies before even getting to the stage of the investment process based on some of this ESG data. And I think you shared an interesting paper recently on green patents and the contribution from energy companies there. So maybe you could share some thoughts on that and screening where it works and where maybe it's not useful.
Yeah, absolutely. So what this study did, it wasn't by me, but by some other academics, looked at, well, how many green patents, and green patents are patents that help the environment, for example, through greater energy efficiency or renewable energy, for example. And these were being produced more by the fossil fuel sector than almost any other sector. So actually, the fossil fuel companies, which often we might want to divest from, these are some of the major sources of energy innovation, and they need to be because they've a number of them have announced transition plans. So if you think of an energy company as a combination of brown fossil fuel assets and green renewable energy assets, it's not necessarily clear that we want to divest from them blanketly. So the problem with divestment is because it's very binary, it divides the world into good and bad, then what message does it send if you're the CEO of an energy company? It might send the message, oh, it's not worth you being really serious about decarbonisation because you're going to be sold anyway. Right? There's certain investors who are just always going to dump you if you're just an energy company, regardless of even if you're best in class in terms of decarbonisation. So instead, the more nuanced approach is, yes, climate change is a really serious issue. Yes, this is a problematic sector, but if you are best in class in terms of decarbonisation, then we will actually hold your stock. that's something which does give you the incentives to try to take this issue seriously. Otherwise, if you're blanketly going to be sold, regardless of whatever you do, then it might be that the company thinks, oh, let me just milk my short-term profits anyway. And I think this is the same for virtually anything that we see. So there are other industries, like at Royal London Asset Management, we used to hold some alcohol companies. We sold, but only because of valuation, not because we don't believe that this is ethical anymore. Now, obviously, alcohol is a problematic sector, but I think to have a blanket exclusion policy would be to say the world would be better off with prohibition, where alcohol has never got a role in society. And probably when things open up again, I don't think many people would agree that alcohol should be completely banned from the world. Yet, because it's problematic, we will only hold an alcohol company if you're best in class in terms of low water usage, low carbon emissions, promotion of responsible drinking, responsible advertising, and so on. There are certain industries that we will blanketly not hold, such as tobacco. When you do have a blanket exclusion criterion, that is saying, we do think that the world might be better without this industry, but the subset of industries for which that is the case is much smaller than what many other investors think. Unfortunately, there is still now a need for fossil fuels because we haven't yet fully developed enough renewable energy sources. Maybe things will be different in a decade or two's time, but right now there might still be a place in society for an energy company which is decarbonising.
Perfect. And just staying on the subject of data and moving to ESG ratings. So there are some companies out there which aggregate some of this data and they put a rating on a company based on essentially their opinion on how highly they score on these three pillars. But there's been a lot of academic research on these ratings, and perhaps some of the aggregate confusion around the way they don't always seem to correlate as well as other types of ratings, like credit ratings, for example. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on ESG ratings and ratings providers.
Thanks for asking that, Ainsley, because people lament the inconsistency of ESG ratings as a problem with the industry. So where does this inconsistency come from? Well, it might be that MSCI rates a company highly on ESG and Sustainalytics rates a company lowly. And so there's many people who say, well, if the rating agencies who are paid to analyze sustainability can't even agree on who's sustainable or not, then there's no hope in any progress. Investors should just ignore sustainability because there's no way of agreeing on it. And I think that's a really incorrect assessment, because another way of saying inconsistency and disagreement, that's just a diversity of opinion, right? So they might just disagree on whether a company is responsible, not because the data is bad, not because there's massive confusion here, but they might just look at different things. So it might be if you have an energy company decarbonizing, one rating agency might place more emphasis on the speed of decarbonization, but another might recognize the importance of workers to make sure that you're not decarbonizing so quickly that workers are out of jobs. And different people have different tastes. They have different weights that they'll put on the environment versus workers. And even if you have a single issue, people might disagree on how to measure that issue. Right, so let's say we care about gender parity. Do I measure the percentage of women on the board? Do I measure the percentage of women in senior management, the percentage of women throughout the workforce, the gender pay gap? Now, you might say, well, measure all of them, but if you measure all of them, well, what weight do we put on these different metrics and so on? And if it's diversity more generally, if we were to have a man in charge, but from a very different background, or maybe if this person's an ethnic minority, is that okay? Again, we'll have different opinions. So like anything sort of important will be subjective, right? Traditional investors will look at management quality. Now, nobody will agree. There's no single measure of management quality. Different people will disagree as to whether a manager is a good or bad manager. That doesn't mean people are going to say, I'm going to completely ignore quality of management of a company because nobody can agree. The fact that people can't agree actually makes that even more attractive as an investment criterion. Because if nobody can agree on this, then other investors might get it wrong, and you might make money by being able to have some insights that others don't have. Like we all know as an investor, you can't make money by trading on something which is already on the market, right? So if there was a perfect measure of sustainability that everybody agreed on, then it would already be in the stock price and nobody would be able to make money by trading on it. So it's indeed the fact that sustainability is really difficult to measure. That's why I do think it's something that is promising for investors to take a look at. So then what does that mean for ESG ratings? Am I saying, oh, well, it's inconsistent, but we don't care? No. What I'm saying is that we can't just take an ESG rating off the shelf and just trade according to that, not reading what the report is about. But it means that we need to actually read the report and see what's underlying the rating. And maybe the rating is low because it's in a problematic industry, but we as an investor, we might think, well, we are happy to invest in that industry if you're best in class, and so on. So just like you would never immediately just follow a equity analyst's buy or sell rating, right? You would read the report behind it, and there might be some analysts saying buy and some analysts saying sell, so you're going to read the different opinions and form your view. That's exactly what we will do with ESG ratings. So the fact that we have a diversity of opinion, right, that's not a problem. And ironically, right, one of the ESG dimensions that people look at is diversity. People seem to think, oh, diversity of perspectives is a good thing. And then when they find a diversity of perspectives on ESG ratings, they think it's a bad thing, which is a bit weird, right? I am glad that I'm going to have 5 different opinions from these 5 different rating agencies. If they were all the same, then I might as well just only look at one of them.
Similar to how sort of a value investor has different definitions for value in units of companies. So in terms of the link between some ESG measures or this nebulous concept that's ESG and future returns, there's obviously been a lot of research out there, and one point I thought was very interesting. Fundamentally, if you think of an objective disinvesting from brown companies for some ESG investors or more simple companies, if you like, is starving them of financing or raising the cost of capital for these firms. But obviously, on the flip side of that, a firm's cost of capital is an investor's expected return. So if a firm is incurring a higher interest rate on its debt because more people are divesting, that the investors of that debt are sort of earning a higher return, all else being equal. Is in terms of performance and ESG investing, is there a relationship there in terms of what the research says? And should responsible investors be expecting to underperform, outperform, or is it more nuanced than that?
Yeah, thank you. So first, there's this. You're right to bring this up. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance or doublethink about sort of the effect of ESG on the cost of capital. So there is this view that, as you're saying, Ainsley, that if we just dump fossil fuel stocks indiscriminately, then that will drive the stock price down, raise the cost of capital. But then, if the stock price is really low, right, if these companies are too cheap, then it means that you can earn outsized returns by buying these fossil fuel companies because they are too cheap. And then that contradicts one of the other arguments for ESG investing, which is you can make more money by doing ESG investing. So you can't have it both ways, right? Either you earn higher returns by buying companies with good ESG, or you earn lower returns by buying them and therefore they have a lower cost of capital. But you can't have both higher returns and a lower cost of capital, because the cost of capital is the return that you get as an investor in these companies. Okay, so that's the point, is that you can't have it both. Well, what does the evidence say that you are actually getting? And so here the evidence is rather mixed. So my first paper on this looked at employee satisfaction. It looked at companies that treat their workers well. And I had 28 years of data. What I showed was that companies that are on the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. And so that's a lot. That's 89 to 184% compounded. And importantly, that period, I started in 1984 and ended in 2011, that contained the financial crisis, that contained the collapse of the internet bubble. So it's something that worked in both good times and bad times. So that suggests that actually ESG companies, at least when you define it in terms of employees, do outperform. You can do well and do good. And so that was the message of my first TEDx talk and also my book. Now, there's obviously certain things you need to do to show, is it correlation or is it causation? Is it employee satisfaction that leads to better performance, or better performance that leads to employee satisfaction? That's all in the paper. I'm not going to bore you with the gory details right now, but overall that suggests that you earn higher returns by investing in companies that treat their workers well. And that shouldn't be massively surprising, right? It means that workers are more likely to stay, they're more motivated, and so on. But why did I say the evidence is mixed? It's when you expand beyond employees to other E and S dimensions, you don't always outperform. So in particular, it depends on the materiality of the stakeholder issue. So what do I mean by materiality? Well, there's lots of different stakeholders. There's customers, the environment, employees, and so on. But there are certain stakeholders that might be more material to your business than others. So if you are in the mining industry, obviously the environment is really material. An environmental disaster like Rio Tinto with Duke and George, that could really hurt your reputation. But on the flip side, if you are a bank, at least your direct effect on the environment might not be that high. What might matter for you more is customer privacy, data security, selling practices. You don't want to be in a fake payment protection insurance scandal. And so what the evidence suggests is that only outperformance on the material dimensions leads to higher stock returns, not just being indiscriminately focused on any measure of ESG doesn't always lead to outperformance. So this is really important, because many investors and many sort of citizens and voters think that a company should tick as many boxes as possible, when actually it's not your responsibility as a business to solve every single problem in the world, but to focus on the issues that are most material for you. Just like a person shouldn't be both an investor and a doctor and a teacher and a lawyer, right? You would focus on one or two of those things.
And going back to your original paper, which is very interesting on best companies, that you I think you extended that study globally as well outside of the US, and there's some interesting results. Maybe you can talk about those. This is based on employee satisfaction.
Absolutely, yeah. So you're right. My initial data set was on the US, and why was that? It was because the data was available from 1984 in the US. Now there are similar lists elsewhere. They started somewhat later. And I found that the results generally held. So it generally is the case that companies that treat their workers better do better. But it's not always the case. And in particular, in countries with a lot of labour market regulation, let's say France and Germany, where the government is already guaranteeing good wages and protection from dismissal and so forth, then in fact, maybe the companies that are right at the top might be overly investing in their workers, and they might be doing this and maybe forgetting about shareholders. So this is important because, again, it suggests the results might be context specific, and we don't want to have this box ticking issue that, oh, we always want to have the best companies to work for in our portfolio. Maybe if we are in a country where workers are already well protected, maybe having a company which is sort of slightly above average, that's good enough. You don't want to be in one extreme.
Fantastic. And moving to sort of your book, and there's there's a lot you cover in there, in particular with a focus on governance and the role that plays, and there's many different aspects, and takeover defenses, buybacks, but one maybe we could focus on is executive compensation and CEO pay. Because there's many counterintuitive results in the book on the performance of companies based on these metrics. So you can talk a little bit about that, particularly because it's often gets a lot of mainstream attention.
Absolutely. Like if there's one issue that gets people angry, just the general public, about how unfair the business is, it's CEO pay. And people often look at the ratio of the CEO's pay to the workers' pay. So these ratios, I think, is about 150 to 1 in the UK, which means that in just 3 days, a CEO earns as much as her entire worker does in the entire year. So that just seems really unfair. And there are people who argue that the greater this pay ratio, the worse the performance of companies, because employees get upset and they think it's unfair if the CEO is overpaid, and therefore this is bad for morale. And this is based on some supposed research showing that relationship. But you mentioned, Ainsley, that I've testified in the UK Parliament. So a few years ago, there was a House of Commons inquiry into the corporate governance. And the witness before me quoted that evidence. They said, there is research here showing that the greater the pay ratio, the worse the performance. And this was the session before me. And I was intrigued. And I thought, well, I know the executive pay literature very well. I don't know this paper. Let me look it up. And I looked it up. I looked at the witness's statement. So I found the paper. I looked at the paper, and the paper said, no, the opposite result. The greater the pay ratio, the better the performance of the company. I thought, well, how could this be? And then I went back to the witness's statement, and the witness actually quoted a half-finished version of the paper, right? So it was 2016. The finished version had already been out since 2013, so the witness could have chosen the correct version, but the witness had handpicked a version from 2010 before it had gone through peer review and corrected its mistakes because it found the result that they wanted. So this is why I think it's really important to be very careful with academic research, right? We can have a common phrase is research finds that X. But we need to be careful about this. You can always find a study to find almost anything, right? If I want an excuse to drink red wine this evening, I'm sure I could find new studies finding that it's good for my health. So the research actually shows that pay ratios are, if anything, linked to better company performance. And so this is against the idea that we should use the pay ratio as a ESG screen. So if the ratio is not the right thing to look at, what is the right thing to look at? It's the horizon of pay. So whether the CEO is paid according to, let's say, the stock price or profits in 2 years, or maybe in 5 or 10 years' time. And so there's a very nice study by Caroline Flammer and Tima Bansal that's covered in chapter 5 of my book, which shows that when CEOs are paid according to the long term, not only is the company more profitable, but also the company's more innovative, and also the company treats its employees better. So it grows the pie, not just for shareholders, but also wider society. And indeed, the problem with the pay ratio is it's based on the idea of pie splitting. It assumes a fixed pie. So if the CEO is better paid, it means that everybody else is worse paid. But if you're paying the CEO according to the long term, she now has incentives to grow the pie. She knows that, okay, I'm going to be paid according to how my company does in 5 to 10 years' time. I better make sure that my employees are well treated and are trained, because if not, I'm not going to have a business in 5 years' time.
And then one example you use is Reckitt Benckiser and the CEO recently. Maybe you can tell us that sort of anecdote.
Yeah, well, actually, maybe I'll use an even more more modern anecdote, which came out after the book, which is Disney. So you might remember last year, or no, so 2 years ago, it was announced that Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, was being paid $66 million. And people said that this was outrageous. Abigail Disney said this was insane, that somebody was paid so much, which is it's kind of ironic because she is an heiress. So she's inheriting lots of wealth but not really creating value. But that's to one aside. But if you looked at how had Disney's company done, well, it had created 75 billion of value within the last month, and he was being paid 66 million. Now, clearly, we don't just care about the past month, we care about long-term performance. But in the 4 years since Bob Iger had been in charge, Disney's total shareholder return was 578%, whereas the market had gone up by 140%. And you might think, well, that's only shareholders, but the company created 70,000 jobs. It created a lot of great products for customers. So the only reason that Bob Iger was paid so much was the company had done really well. And fair pay is pay linked to performance. So he'd done very well just as a byproduct of that. And so people were outraged at his $66 million and said, well, that's at the expense of other people. But it wasn't at the expense of anyone else. It was just as a byproduct of just doing really well and creating a lot of value. Now you might still think, well, do you need to, okay, done well, do you need to give him 66 million? Surely a good CEO would have wanted to do this intrinsically, just for doing a good job. But notice that 66 million, he wasn't given that at the outset, right? He was given some shares. And if those shares do well, then they could just go up in value. right? So just like shareholders in that company, right, they made a load of money, even though they put no effort into it, right? They just ridden on the coattails of Babaga. Similarly, I think, manager should be a co-owner of her business, and then you just automatically do well if your company goes up in value. This is what just being a co-owner means, and I think that's the model that we want, where managers do have skin in the game in their own business and are tied to its long-term success.
Yeah, and then that's one of sort of many counterintuitive examples you have, which are very interesting. I thought there was you wrote recently about Milton Friedman and how some of his maybe his views on which obviously very much free market capitalists were perhaps some of the views against him were not necessarily how do you put it, productive if the end product is to improve society. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the importance of profits as well as purpose for a business.
Yeah, absolutely. So Milton Friedman wrote 51 years ago that the social responsibility of business is to improve profits. And like, this is now ridiculed and seen as just the most evil statement. And like, to be accepted into polite society, it's almost to the point that you need to say how much you disagree with Milton Friedman. But actually, many people who criticize him haven't actually read the full article. And his argument was that the reason why it's okay for a company to focus on profits is as long as those are defined as long-term profits, in order to be profitable in the long term, a company needs to treat society well. Like, it can't pollute the environment or its brand will be hurt. It can't mistreat its workers or they'll leave. And it has to take care of its customers, otherwise they'll walk away. So the reason why he said, okay, it's fine, just focus on profits, is not because it was evil. It's not because he sort of said, we just only need to make money and greed is good and everything else is fluffy. No, he said, focus on profits, but as long as you define those profits as long-term, you need to then take society very seriously and invest in those. So I do think that Milton Friedman actually has much more in common with responsible business than we often believe. And unfortunately, this debate on responsible business has become really polarized, where there's a lot of people just out there and saying really extreme things. Businesses are evil, capitalism is evil, profit is bad. And the more extreme you say something, unfortunately, the more viral you go. However, I don't think that this idea of portraying profits as evil is a good thing. Why? Because profits have an important role in society. I don't need to tell you as an investor this, right? Investors are not nameless, faceless capitalists, right? They involve pension funds saving for retirement, sometimes university endowments funding future teaching and research. So we do need profits, but there also needs to be a balance. And so where I will disagree with Friedman is the following. So he argues that you should invest in society in order to make profit. So profit is the end goal. I am saying purpose is the end goal. And if you achieve that, then you will become profitable. So I'm saying purpose comes first and then profit follows. Friedman says profit comes first and then purpose is something you'll need to do to get to profit. Why do I think my view of the world is different and perhaps superior? Is that Friedman says that you should only invest in stakeholders if you can calculate the benefits. So he would say you should only invest in your workers, let's say give them more parental leave, if you can calculate how much more productive they're going to be, how much more money I'm going to make because of their productivity, and does this exceed the cost of parental leave? Now, you can do calculations when you're investing in machines or anything tangible where you can have clear calculations, but when you're investing in people, or when you're investing in your carbon footprint, if I'm to reduce my carbon footprint, how many more people will work for me? You have no idea of that. So the whole beauty of purpose is that we can do things because they're the right thing to do. Not because they're justified by a calculation. We're doing this because we think it's moral and ethical and good business. And then what my research suggests, and the research of a few others, is that this does ultimately lead to profit in the long term, particularly if it's on a material stakeholder issue. So we should be driven by purpose first, and then the profits follow. And the role of research is to show that that is not wishful thinking. It is something which is backed up by large-scale data.
And in terms of when companies are doing something for stakeholders as opposed to just the subset of their shareholders, you have this concept of comparative advantage and the importance of focusing on what a company perhaps can do better than, say, just giving that money to a charity. Maybe you can tell us about comparative advantage and how that fits in.
That's really important, Ainsley. So often people think that responsibility is just to do things to help society, and the more you're doing to help society, the better. But whenever you're using resources to help society, there's always an opportunity cost. So let's say, Ainsley, you and I were investors in, let's say, Vodafone, and Vodafone chooses to donate profits to, let's say, Black Lives Matter. Right, so that was a reaction of many companies in the light of Mr. Floyd's tragic death. Let's sort of signal to the world that we care about diversity. And obviously, you and I will be people who care about diversity. So you might think, well, we shouldn't object to Vodafone giving this, but it might be, right? If Vodafone gives money to Black Lives Matter, what is the opportunity cost? Instead, it could have given this to us in the form of higher dividends if we're investors, or maybe higher wages if we were employees. And we could choose what charities we want to support. So maybe I would give to Black Lives Matter, but maybe I would give to cancer research, or maybe I would give to an environmental charity or an animal rights charity. Maybe somebody else won't give it to charity at all, but will send it to send his children to school. So it is not for the company to decide what is the socially responsible activity. They don't have comparative advantage in that. But if instead Vodafone uses its money to launch, uses its resources to launch M-Pesa, this mobile money service in Kenya, which lifted, as I mentioned, hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty, that's something that only Vodafone can do because it has its unique expertise. So one question I'm always asked is, how can investors tell which companies are genuinely purposeful rather than just greenwashing? It's the ones that apply what I call comparative advantage. They're focusing on the responsible issues that they can move the needle on most, rather than just responding to whatever issue happens to be the order of the day, which recently was diversity and inclusion.
Fantastic. So moving on to a topic of your more recent TED talk on how to interpret evidence and spotting sort of fake news in a post-truth world, and I'm glad you mentioned that your experience when testifying to Parliament and the speaker before you and how they interpreted the results of that paper. You also published something on evaluating research, a short piece recently, which I really enjoyed. Maybe you can talk about your motivations for that talk, but also how that fits in terms of for investors, especially these days with so many academic papers and research out there.
Absolutely. So what the TED talk was and my recent piece was about was confirmation bias. So what is confirmation bias? It's the temptation to accept evidence that confirms what we would like to be true, and we would reject evidence that we don't want to be true. So let's say you're a climate change denier. Well, if there was a study showing that climate change was a hoax, you'd immediately latch onto it and tweet it and share it, even without looking at the methodology and seeing if it's rigorous. And then conversely, if there was a study showing climate change is actually really real, you might immediately dismiss the study or say, oh, maybe the people are biased or funded by some left-wing conspiracy group or something like that. So we respond to papers and studies based on whether we like them rather than whether they're actually good. And this is really problematic because now in the world of the internet, we can find studies on nearly everything. Right? There's almost any topic we could find a study just by Googling it. And it does mean that as investors, if we have our own biases as to what we would like to put into our portfolio, we might be able just to find some research which supports it. So let's say if you were to be somebody who thinks, oh, companies with all male teams perform better because there's sort of greater commonality, I'm sure you'd be able to find some evidence suggesting that. So what I did in this TED talk and also this recent piece called Evaluating Research, you can easily find it on my website, alexedmans.com, is just to do a simple check of whether we can actually trust something. I'm not going to go through every single point, but let me just go through one. And this asks, is a paper published in a top peer-reviewed journal? So why is that important? Well, the process of academic peer review means that a paper has to be scrutinized by the world's leading experts on a topic. So I'm actually a managing editor of a journal, and we reject 95% of papers. Why? Because when we send it to the experts from Harvard and Stanford, they will say, well, actually, your methodology is wrong, your methodology is flawed, and so forth. So it makes sure that we only publish papers which are really, really rigorous. Now, there are some people who say, well, that's not satisfactory because there's publication bias. So they like to throw around the words publication bias as a license to ignore whether a paper is peer-reviewed and quote whatever they want to, but they haven't actually been part of the peer review process. So this is something that I see firsthand in my job. But what they mean by publication bias is they seem to think, oh, journal editors will only publish papers that sort of support the common academic orthodoxy. They won't publish anything new. This is absolutely not the case, right? The journals get their reputation by publishing innovative research. The one measure on which journals live and die is called the impact factor. That is the number of times that papers are cited by other papers. So if you are the first paper in a new field, you're going to be cited tons of times, right? Kahneman and Tversky, who brought the idea of behavioral economics into mainstream world. Why Kahneman won the Nobel Prize was he was the first person to do that. His papers were widely cited. Being the 10th paper, finding something that we already know will not be cited. So if anything, right, our incentives are skewed in the wrong direction to try to publish really innovative research, even if it's not careful. So this is why, as editors, we will hire peer reviewers to sort of curb our natural editorial enthusiasm to go after everything that's new and make sure that is actually backed up by evidence. The final thing is that you might think, well, how do we know what is a top peer review journal? In fact, there's thousands of journals out there, but there's simple lists out there. So the Financial Times has a list of the top 50 journals. Now, when I say focus on the top peer review journals, people might sometimes accuse me of being sort of elitist by saying, oh, we only want papers published in the top journals. But I do think it is important, right? If you wanted a medical opinion, to get a medical opinion from the Royal Marsden Hospital, you place more weight on that than a medical opinion from a hospital that we've never heard of. Now, it's absolutely not the case that papers in top journals are always correct and papers in lower journals are always wrong. This is one factor to use. Just like when you hire somebody, you might presumably look at what university they went to. It's not always the case that somebody from Cambridge is always better from somebody from a different university, but it's one factor and it'll be taken into account. And so that's how I would encourage the use of peer review, not to be dogmatic about it, but it's an important factor.
And then sort of marrying that with our conversation on purposeful business is maybe talking about the role of the big technology firms in society today. Since we mentioned in how easy it is to find a confirming view, particularly with the internet and everything else, and the role that social media has played in the last few years in geopolitics and otherwise. From the sort of purposeful business angle or the ESG angle, do you have any views on big technology firms and how they fit in?
Yeah, so with big tech, what they want is they want people to feel good when you go on to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And so this would involve giving you stuff that makes you happy, and what makes you happy is stuff that confirms your viewpoint. So if I was a climate change denier, then lots of posts which were on that would be ones that they would show me, and that would lead me to clicking on them and sharing them and so on. And this is again why we have such polarization of views, is if big tech gives you the views that you want to hear, regardless of whether they're backed up by evidence, then somebody on one side, let's say the left side, will become more left, somebody on the right side will become even more right, when actually, with many of these things, the right answer is somewhere in the middle. So I do think it's responsible for big tech not to have these algorithms just to give people what they want to hear, but to ensure that they are going to hear a dissenting viewpoint. Now, this is where purpose might be different from profit, is that, okay, if you're just focused on short-term profit, that is not going to maximize engagement. But maybe in the long term, right, it will be something which is going to attract sort of more the thinking man or the thinking woman will be more willing to use a platform that gives them sort of both sides. So there are places like the Real Clear Foundation, or you might have heard of Real Clear Politics, and what they deliberately try to do is to put the evidence on both sides. And that's something I try and do in my books. And maybe my book might have gone more viral and sold more had I said responsibility always pays off. In every case, don't bother about profit. But in some saying, here it does work, here it doesn't work. This is what the evidence lays out. And yes, somebody who wants to overthrow capitalism might not immediately like this, but somebody like you has been very, very supportive of it. And that's why I'm really happy speaking to people who are happy to hear both viewpoints. And I do think with big tech, while it might think, let's immediately try and get as maximum usage as possible, I think in the long term, if you are seen as a platform which was a reliable source of information, then that would be good. Then you wouldn't have people saying, my New Year's resolution is to go off Facebook. Right? If this was an informative source which gives you viewpoints from both sides, then people would not start having this idea of deleting Facebook being a good thing.
Perfect. And in terms of generational differences on views on not just technology but purposeful business as well, you know, the reason that's interesting for investment firms is there's obviously a lot of wealth that's going to be probably changing hands generationally over the next decade or so. And you know, in terms of your roles as a lecturer as well, you probably have more interactions with Gen Z than maybe most. Do you have any insights in terms of your interactions there on how maybe views are changing with regards to purpose and you know, capitalism or even with technology, that all those interactions?
Absolutely. So this is what's changed really a lot over my 14 years as a professor. So if in 2007, when I started at Wharton, I spoke about purpose, I would have been laughed out of the room, or people would just leave the room politely but quickly. Whereas now people really care about this. And so I launched this new elective called Responsible Business last May. And the majority of people there were not people going into CSR or ESG roles. They were going into mainstream business roles, but they wanted to ensure that the businesses that they would run, or the businesses they would work for, or the businesses they would invest in were businesses that were responsible. So this is something which they really care about. And companies need to think about their purpose, because if not, they're not going to be attracting the top talent. So this is why I'm highlighting that there's not just a moral case for purpose, there's a business case, right? If you want your employees to be engaged and to join the company, and you spoke earlier about sort of the pandemic, Ainsley, and now that most work is not being directly supervised by sort of your boss, you're working from home, a lot of effort is discretionary. And this is why I think having a mission is important, because otherwise the tendency to slack off is obviously much greater than when you're in the office and there's concepts of FaceTime and so on. So given that Gen Z really, I do think, does care about purpose, this is why it's even more urgent for companies to take this seriously. And notice that I am interacting only with a very small section of the population, right? Those who go to business school to get, say, MBA degrees. So you might think if there was a subset of the population who doesn't care about it, maybe it would be the subset. But the fact that, well, this subset really does care about it, then I think in general the new cohorts are taking this really seriously as employees, also as customers, right? There will be people who are willing to pay more to buy organic food rather than traditionally farmed food, and so forth. This is going to be reflecting in their purchasing decisions.
Fantastic. No, it's been wonderful to get your views on all things purposeful business. So I'd love to conclude with a few sort of non-work questions, if you like.
Sure.
So I think you spoke as well about it was maybe one of your Gresham lectures on fitness and well-being matters, and you know how it takes work to stop working sometimes, which may be even more important now that we're all stuck at home. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you do outside of academia and you know your day-to-day roles to switch off.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I'm really into is sports and fitness. So even at MIT, when I was when I was doing my PhD, I was athletics director of my hall, so in charge of all of the sports teams. At Wharton, as a assistant professor, I actually captained the MBA ice hockey team for 3 years. And now at London Business School, I take my students to Barry's boot camp, which is this brutal boot camp in London and in Manchester. And so why do I do this? I do think it's really important for people's long-term sort of happiness and effectiveness is to take care of yourself. If we think about the idea of sustainability for companies, right, applying that to an individual, that is something which involves short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. So yes, it's a sacrifice to spend an hour working out. It's time away from working, and also it's certainly when you start, it involves effort and might not be pleasant for somebody new to it. But just the long-term benefits it has in terms of your health are massive. So this is why I'm quite evangelical about sort of highlighting to my students the importance of this. But also, it's not just the long-term benefits in terms of your health in 10 years' time, but right now, the benefits of mental break and your mental health for doing something away from work are huge. So in the pandemic, obviously things are really difficult. You can't go to the pub, you can't go to restaurants. And you could have a big excuse like, I can't go to the gym and I don't have weights right now. But 1 year has passed. If you really wanted weights, you could have got weights. Right? And even if you don't have weights, there's so many great platforms out there which allow you to do body weight exercises. So I signed up to this platform called Grindhouse. It was founded by some ex-Barry's Masters trainers, and so I've been with them since they launched 2 months ago. So they have a great workout every day. I actually did one just before we filmed this interview, and so there is so many excuses you could have. I don't have an access to the gym. But now that you have these online platforms, some of them require equipment and some of them don't require equipment, these are things that everybody can take a priority of. And I had 2 calls between 1 and 3. I've got this interview with you now. I've got something after that. Had I just worked the entire day, I would probably not be energetic for this interview. But the fact that I'm able to do this interview is because I'd scheduled that break in. And so I thought, no, let me spend an hour for myself. I'm going to turn my phone off. I'm going to just focus on this exercise. And that makes me productive at work, as well as being good for my physical fitness.
And outside of fitness, I noticed you used to play chess for the Junior England's national team. So why did you give that up? And what do you do other than fitness as well?
Yeah, so I played chess from when I was young, and I think that taught me a lot of things. I think the more important thing it taught me was was losing, right? So when I first lost games, I'd burst into tears because I was 5 years old when I started playing. But actually losing is part of life. And so the way to avoid losing would be to just play in the easiest tournaments. But it would be that, like, even at my primary school, which went up to 13, we would play in the under 15s leagues, not the under 13s leagues, to challenge ourselves. And we lost, but we always wanted to try to get better. And like now, often there's the mentality, let's make sure I don't make a mistake. And if a company announces a climate change target and doesn't hit it, it's told it's being a hypocrite. But actually, well, if that's your attitude, then people will just set the easiest targets, right? We want to stretch ourselves. Some of your viewers will know this idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, right? If we indeed want to grow and challenge ourselves, there will be some failures. And so I think that's what chess instilled in me. Why I gave it up is just when I sort of got to university, there's lots of other things to do there, and I think sports and fitness were more fun and more social. Also, chess is something that you can just do later in life, whereas ice hockey is not something that you can do when you're older because it's so damaging. So chess is something I can still do, and because of online, the world we're now in, I've actually started taking up a bit more in the pandemic. So I do think it still does good discipline. So it's something I think was great for me to learn when growing up. I think it's important part of a child's development to do something like that.
Perfect. No, thanks again. It's been a fantastic conversation. Is there anything you'd like to share before we finish?
I would just say that I think for too long people have thought about responsibility as being like a nice to have extra. It has this moral case for it, but a hard-headed businessman or businesswoman shouldn't really think about it because they should be focused on running the business. But what I want to say is that these two things are not in conflict, right? Responsibility is consistent with long-term success. As long as you do it in a measured way, you recognize that a company's responsibility is not to solve all of the world's problems, but to focus on a few issues where it has comparative advantage, so it's good at doing it, and those are affecting material stakeholders, stakeholders that are critical to the business. So I do think it's something that every business person or every investor should take seriously. And this is not based on wishful thinking, it's based on rigorous evidence. But often rigorous academic evidence is written in boring journals to be buried in the library. So that's why I wanted to write the book, Grow the Pie, was to highlight this research, make it accessible for an audience, and to have some frameworks for putting it into practice.
Perfect. No, thanks. Thanks again to Alex, and thanks to our audience for listening. So after this is finished, you'll automatically be redirected to a survey on this event. If you could spare a few minutes, we'd greatly appreciate your feedback. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us, and all the best. Please keep well.
Thanks very much, Ainsley. It was great to be here. Thanks for the interview.